The cigarette smoke hung in the humid air of Colonel Merritt Edson's command post as he studied the map spread across an ammunition crate on the evening of September 11th, 1942. His finger traced a thin ridgeline south of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, a nameless geological feature that jutted from the jungle like a fishhook. The ridge was less than a mile from the airstrip that represented America's entire strategic position in the Solomon Islands. If Henderson Field fell, 11,000 Marines would be isolated, cut off, and likely destroyed. Edson's finger stopped on that ridge, and he made a decision that would define the next 48 hours. He would put his raiders there, all 840 men of them, directly in the path of what intelligence suggested would be the main Japanese assault. His officers thought he was positioning them for rest. Edson knew better. He was placing them in a killing ground, where they would either hold or die trying. The mathematics were straightforward and terrifying. Japanese Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was leading approximately 3,000 troops through the jungle south of the American perimeter. Edson had 840 Marines, most of them exhausted from weeks of continuous combat, many suffering from malaria and dysentery, all of them operating on reduced rations because the Navy couldn't guarantee regular supply runs. The American defensive doctrine from Fort Benning said you needed a 3-to-1 advantage to successfully assault a prepared position. Kawaguchi had roughly a 3.5-to-1 advantage. The doctrine also said defenders needed mutually supporting strongpoints, overlapping fields of fire, and reserves for counterattack. Edson had a ridge with 3 small hills, limited ammunition, and no reserves because every available Marine was already committed to the perimeter defense. What Edson did have was knowledge that most of his superiors lacked. He understood that the Japanese would come at night, that they would attack in waves designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers, and that the ridge he'd just marked on his map was the only covered approach to Henderson Field from the south. If he was wrong about any of this, he would lose the airfield. If he was right but his Marines couldn't hold, he would lose the airfield, and probably 800 men in the process. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Merritt Austin Edson was 45 years old in September 1942, ancient by infantry standards, and he looked every year of it. His men called him Red Mike, partly for his reddish hair that was now streaked with grey, partly for his reputation for aggressive tactics that bordered on reckless. He joined the Marines in 1917, served in France during World War I, spent the 1920s hunting bandits in Nicaragua, where he'd earned his first Navy Cross, and spent the 1930s becoming one of the Marine Corps' foremost experts on small unit tactics. The 1st Raider Battalion that he commanded was an experimental unit, formed in February 1942 based on British commando concepts and designed for exactly the kind of fluid, aggressive warfare that the Pacific Theatre demanded. The selection process for the Raiders had been brutal. Edson personally interviewed candidates and rejected anyone he thought lacked the physical conditioning or mental toughness for sustained combat. The men who made it through training at Quantico were subjected to forced marches carrying 80-pound packs, small boat operations in rough seas, and live fire exercises that occasionally resulted in actual casualties. The idea was to create Marines who could operate behind enemy lines with minimal support, who could endure hardship that would break regular infantry, and who would fight with an intensity that shocked even veteran Japanese troops. By August 1942, when the Raiders landed at Tulagi as part of Operation Watchtower, they were as ready as any American unit could be for what awaited them in the Solomons. Guadalcanal itself was a miserable piece of real estate, 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered in jungle so thick that visibility rarely exceeded 20 feet. The island's interior rose to mountains over 8,000 feet high, and between the coast and those mountains lay swamps, rivers, and dense vegetation that made movement exhausting and navigation nearly impossible without native guides. The climate was hot and humid year-round, with temperatures regularly exceeding 90 degrees and rainfall measuring over 150 inches annually. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes bred in every stagnant pool. Dengue fever infected troops who'd avoided malaria. Dysentery spread through units, despite aggressive sanitation efforts. Fungal infections attacked feet that stayed wet for days. Guadalcanal wasn't just an enemy position to be captured. It was an environment actively trying to kill everyone who landed there. The strategic importance of this miserable island derived from a single feature. The airfield the Japanese had begun constructing at Lunga Point in July 1942. From that airfield, Japanese bombers could strike at Allied shipping lanes connecting the United States to Australia, effectively cutting off an entire continent from resupply and reinforcement. The Japanese understood this clearly, which was why they'd begun building the field. The Americans understood it just as clearly, which was why Admiral Ernest King had pushed for Operation Watchtower despite objections from commanders who thought the forces available were inadequate for an amphibious assault. On August 7, 1942, 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division had landed on Guadalcanal and captured the airfield with surprisingly little resistance. The Japanese construction workers had fled into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and a nearly complete runway. The Marines finished the construction, named it Henderson Field, after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, and prepared to defend it against the counterattack they knew was coming. That counterattack arrived piecemeal throughout August and early September. The first attempt came on August 21 at the Tenaru River, where approximately 900 Japanese troops under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki charged directly into prepared Marine positions and were essentially annihilated. 800 Japanese dead for 34 Marine casualties was the kind of kill ratio that looked impressive in after-action reports. But it taught the Americans a disturbing lesson. The Japanese didn't surrender. Wounded Japanese soldiers would wait until Marines approached to render aid, then detonate grenades that killed everyone nearby. Medical personnel treating captured Japanese troops were shot by those same prisoners. The cultural and tactical gulf between American and Japanese approaches to warfare was absolute, and it meant that every engagement would be fought to extermination. The failure at Tenaru should have convinced Japanese commanders that frontal assaults against prepared positions were suicidal. Instead, it convinced them they simply hadn't committed enough troops. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was dispatched to Guadalcanal in early September, with orders to recapture Henderson Field, using the forces already on the island, plus reinforcements being delivered by destroyer runs, the Marines called the Tokyo Express. Kawaguchi was a professional soldier, 50 years old, a veteran of campaigns in China and the early Pacific operations. He understood combined arms tactics, the importance of artillery support, and the necessity of reconnaissance before attack. He also understood that his superiors at Rabaul expected him to recapture the airfield quickly, before the Americans could further reinforce their position. What Kawaguchi didn't understand, because Japanese intelligence had failed catastrophically, was how many Marines actually defended the Lunga perimeter. Japanese estimates placed American strength at around 2,000 troops. The actual number was closer to 11,000. That error would cost Kawaguchi most of his brigade. Between September 4th and 7th, Japanese destroyers landed Kawaguchi's troops at Taivu Point, about 20 miles east of the American perimeter. The plan called for a three-pronged attack. One force would strike from the east along the coast. Another would attack from the west, near the Matanikau River. The main effort, Kawaguchi's personal command of approximately 3,000 troops, would hack through the jungle from the south and assault Henderson Field from what he believed was its most vulnerable approach. The march through the jungle was supposed to take 2 days. It took 5. The terrain was worse than Japanese maps indicated, which was saying something because the maps were essentially useless. Rivers that appeared as thin blue lines on paper turned out to be deep, swift-running obstacles requiring hours to cross. Swamps appeared where maps showed solid ground. The vegetation was so dense that troops had to hack their way forward with machetes, making perhaps a half-mile per hour when they weren't simply lost. By September 11th, Kawaguchi's troops were exhausted, hungry, disorganized, and late for their scheduled attack time. They were also exactly where Merritt Edson expected them to be. Edson's understanding of the Japanese approach came from multiple sources. Native scouts, Melanesian men who'd lived on Guadalcanal all their lives and who hated the Japanese occupiers, reported the movement of large forces through the southern jungle. Marine patrols had clashed with Japanese scouts probing the American perimeter. A captured Japanese pilot, shot down and taken prisoner before he could kill himself, disclosed under interrogation that an attack was imminent and that Japanese bombers had been specifically ordered to hit positions south of Henderson Field to soften them for the ground assault. That last piece of information was critical because it told Edson not just that an attack was coming, but where it would come from. On September 11th, Japanese bombers struck the ridge south of Henderson Field, dropping their ordnance directly on the positions where Edson's raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion were digging in. That bombing run killed 2 Marines and wounded several others, but more importantly, it confirmed Edson's analysis. The Japanese were coming from the south, and they were coming soon. Edson spent September 11th repositioning his forces. The ridge he'd selected for defense consisted of 3 distinct hills running, roughly north to south for about 1,200 yards. The northernmost hill, which would later be designated Hill 123 for its elevation in feet, sat less than 1,000 yards from Henderson Field's southern perimeter. That hill would become the critical point, the place where the battle would be won or lost. Edson placed his strongest units there, companies that had fought together since training, and that included his most experienced NCOs. The middle hill he designated for his reserve, such as it was. The southern hill, closest to the expected Japanese approach, was lightly held because Edson knew he couldn't defend the entire ridge with 840 men. His plan was to hold forward positions long enough to identify the main Japanese effort, then withdraw to the prepared positions around Hill 1, 2, 3 and make a stand there with concentrated force. The defensive preparations on September 11th were frantic and improvised. Marines dug foxholes into the volcanic soil, 2-man positions with interlocking fields of fire covering the obvious approaches up the ridge. Machine gun crews positioned their weapons to create grazing fire across likely assault routes. Mortar teams registered their weapons on pre-plotted targets south of the ridge, so they could fire blind during a night attack. Artillery observers from the 11th Marines, the division's artillery regiment, established positions on the ridge, where they could call fire support from the battalion's 105mm howitzers positioned closer to Henderson Field. Wire parties strung communication lines from company command posts back to Edson's headquarters. Corpsmen established aid stations in relatively protected positions, knowing they would be overwhelmed if casualties were heavy. Ammunition was distributed, though not as much as anyone wanted because the Marines were operating on limited supply. Each rifleman received perhaps 120 rounds for his M1 Garand. Machine gunners got a few belts for each weapon. Mortar crews had 20 to 30 rounds per tube. That was it. There would be no resupply until dawn. As darkness fell on September 11th, the ridge was as ready as 840 exhausted Marines could make it. Edson walked the lines, checking positions, talking quietly to squad leaders, making sure everyone understood the plan. His presence was deliberately calming. Edson had a soft voice, almost a whisper, that forced men to lean in to hear him. It created an intimacy that made his instructions feel like personal guidance rather than orders shouted over the chaos of preparation. He told his company commanders the same thing at each position. The Japanese would come after dark. The attacks would be preceded by artillery fire and would consist of infantry charges designed to overwhelm the Marine positions through shock and numbers. The Marines would hold their initial positions as long as possible, then withdraw in order to the ridge line around Hill 123. Once there, they would fight until reinforced or until they were dead. There was no fallback position, there was no plan for retreat. The ridge was the line, and the line would hold. What Edson didn't tell his Marines, because there was no point adding to their burdens, was that he had grave doubts about whether they could actually hold. The force ratios were terrible, the ammunition supply was inadequate, artillery support would be limited during a night action because forward observers couldn't see targets. Air support would be non-existent until dawn. If the Japanese attacked with anything approaching the ferocity they'd shown at Tenaru, but this time with overwhelming numbers and better coordination, the Marines would be in serious trouble. Edson kept those doubts to himself and projected absolute confidence, because that's what leadership demanded. His Marines needed to believe they could hold, even if their commander wasn't entirely sure. The first Japanese probing attacks came around noon on September 12th. These weren't the main assault, just scouts and advance elements testing the Marine positions and trying to determine exactly where the defenders were located. The firefights were brief and intense. Japanese soldiers would emerge from the jungle, fire a few shots, then melt back into the vegetation before the Marines could organize a response. Marine patrols sent forward to investigate reported signs of large-scale troop movements less than 2 miles south of the ridge. Smoke from cooking fires rose from the jungle canopy. Japanese officers were spotted observing the ridge through binoculars. The evidence was clear. Kawaguchi's main force was assembling for a major attack that would come as soon as darkness provided cover. Edson used the afternoon of September 12th to make final adjustments to his defensive plan. He pulled Company C of the raiders back from its forward position on the southern hill after repeated clashes with Japanese scouts made it clear that position was untenable. The company withdrew in good order to positions closer to Hill 1, 2, 3, shortening the defensive line and concentrating forces where they would be needed most. Edson also coordinated with the artillery observers to ensure the 105mm howitzers were registered on the approaches to the ridge. The 11th Marines could fire illumination rounds to light up the battlefield during night fighting, and they could deliver high-explosive rounds on Japanese assembly areas if the forward observers could identify targets. That artillery support would be critical once the main assault began. As twilight descended on September 12th, the 840 Marines on Edson's Ridge settled into their foxholes and waited. The jungle around them was alive with sound insects, birds, the rustle of small animals moving through vegetation. But underneath those natural sounds, the Marines could hear something else. Movement. Lots of movement. The snap of branches being pushed aside, the splash of troops crossing streams. The muted voices of Japanese officers, giving orders in a language the Americans didn't understand, but recognized as preparation for attack. The Marines checked their weapons one more time, made sure their grenades were within easy reach, and prepared to fight for their lives. At approximately 9:30 p.m. on September 12th, the jungle south of Edson's Ridge exploded with artillery fire. Japanese 75mm howitzers hauled piece by piece through the jungle and finally in position to support the infantry assault, opened fire on the Marine positions. The shells weren't particularly accurate. Forward observers in dense jungle at night had limited ability to adjust fire, but accuracy didn't matter when the goal was to force Marines to keep their heads down during the initial assault. Rounds detonated in the treetops, sending white-hot shrapnel down onto the foxholes. Below, high explosive shells crashed into the ridge itself, throwing dirt and rock in all directions. The bombardment lasted about 15 minutes, long enough to convince every Marine on the ridge that this was the real attack. Then, at approximately 9:45 p.m., the first wave of Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle and charged directly up the slope toward the Marine positions. The tactics were exactly what Edson had predicted and prepared for. Japanese troops moved in dense formations, screaming battle cries designed to intimidate defenders and maintain unit cohesion in darkness. Some soldiers carried rifles and fired as they ran. Others carried only bayonets, planning to close with the Marines and fight hand to hand. Still, others hurled grenades ahead of them, trying to destroy machine gun positions that were cutting down their comrades. The assault was terrifying in its intensity and its disregard for casualties. Japanese soldiers ran directly into Marine machine gun fire that was literally mowing down entire ranks, and they kept coming. The Marines responded with disciplined fire that reflected months of training and weeks of combat experience. Riflemen picked their targets, fired, worked the bolt, or let the Garand's gas system cycle the next round into the chamber, and fired again. Machine gunners traversed their weapons back and forth across the assault formations, firing in short bursts to preserve ammunition and prevent barrel overheating. Mortar crews walked rounds up and down the slope, catching Japanese troops in the open with fragmentation shells. The volume of fire was tremendous, the noise absolutely overwhelming, rifles cracking, machine guns chattering, mortars thumping, grenades exploding, and through it all the screams of wounded men and the battle cries of attackers who just wouldn't stop coming. The first wave was shattered before it reached the Marine positions. Bodies littered the slope, some still moving, some already dead, but the Japanese didn't pause to regroup or reassess. A second wave came within minutes, equally dense, equally determined. This time, they got closer before Marine fire stopped them. Japanese soldiers actually reached some foxholes, and fighting broke out with bayonets, rifle butts, and grenades thrown at point-blank range. The savage close-quarters combat lasted only a few minutes before the Marines drove back this assault as well, but those minutes revealed how desperately the Japanese were pressing the attack. This wasn't a probing action or a feint. This was an all-out attempt to break through the Marine lines and reach Henderson Field before dawn. Company B of the Raiders, positioned on the western slope of the ridge, took the brunt of the third wave. Japanese troops had infiltrated through gaps in the Marine lines and were now attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The company commander, Captain William Sperling, reported to Edson that his positions were being overrun, and he needed to pull back or be cut off. Edson authorized the withdrawal but insisted it be conducted in order, with units covering each other as they moved back to secondary positions. What followed was a textbook fighting withdrawal under the worst possible conditions at night, under heavy enemy pressure, through jungle terrain. Marines leapfrogged back position by position, laying down covering fire while other units moved, then moving themselves while the units they'd covered provided suppression fire. Casualties were heavy. Men were hit and couldn't be immediately evacuated. Wounded Marines crawled or were dragged back by corpsmen who exposed themselves to fire to reach injured men. By midnight on September 12th, the Marines had been driven back from their forward positions on the southern end of the ridge and were now concentrated around Hill 1, 2, 3. Edson's defensive line had shrunk from nearly 2,000 yards to perhaps 1,000 yards, and it was growing more, tenuous by the hour. Japanese troops were pressing from three directions. Ammunition was running low. Some machine gun crews were down to their last belt. Casualties were mounting. Dead and wounded filled the aid stations, and every available corpsman was working to stabilize critical injuries. The Marines were exhausted, deafened by hours of continuous fire, and increasingly aware that they might not survive the night. It was at this moment, around 12:30 a.m. on September 13th, that Merritt Edson made his most important contribution to the battle. He moved forward from his command post to a position near the crest of Hill 123, found an empty ammunition crate, climbed on top of it so he was visible to the Marines around him, and began speaking in that characteristic soft voice that somehow cut through the chaos. What he said would be remembered differently by different survivors, but the essential message was consistent. They had done well so far. The Japanese were taking tremendous casualties, but one more night of defense was required. Just one more night. If they could hold until dawn, reinforcements would arrive. Air support would arrive. The situation would change. But right now, at this moment, everything depended on these 840 men holding this ridge. The speech worked not because it was eloquent. Edson wasn't given to flowery rhetoric, but because it came from a man the raiders trusted absolutely. Edson had been with them since the battalion's formation. He'd shared their hardships through training and combat. When he said they could hold, they believed him, even though the evidence suggested otherwise. Marines who'd been contemplating withdrawal, who'd been calculating how far they could retreat before the Japanese overran their position, decided to stay. Not because retreat was impossible, the jungle behind them offered escape routes, but because Edson had asked them to hold, and that was enough. The fighting resumed almost immediately after Edson's speech. The Japanese had used the brief lull to reorganize their forces and prepare for another assault. This time, they came with everything they had left. Artillery fire preceded the infantry attack, heavier than before, more sustained. Japanese 75mm shells crashed into the Marine positions on Hill 123 with methodical precision. Forward observers had finally gotten accurate range and deflection data, and they were using it to devastating effect. Trees exploded into splinters, foxholes collapsed. Marines were buried alive or killed outright by direct hits. The bombardment lasted 20 minutes, the longest continuous artillery barrage the Marines had yet experienced on Guadalcanal. When the shelling stopped, the infantry assault began. Japanese troops emerged from the jungle in formations that stretched across the entire southern face of the ridge. This wasn't a concentrated thrust at a single point. It was a coordinated assault designed to test every section of the Marine defensive line simultaneously. The attackers moved with more discipline than earlier waves had shown. They used fire and movement tactics, some soldiers laying down suppressive fire while others advanced. They carried Bangalore torpedoes to breach wire obstacles that didn't actually exist. The Marines hadn't had time or materials to string wire, but the weapons proved useful for destroying machine gun positions instead. The Marines met this assault with everything they had remaining. Artillery observers called for fire from the 11th Marines, and within minutes, 105mm shells began falling on Japanese assembly areas south of the ridge. The artillery couldn't stop the assault. Too many Japanese troops were already too close to Marine positions, but it disrupted follow-on waves and prevented the attackers from being reinforced during the critical minutes of close combat. Marine mortarmen fired their remaining rounds into the approaching formations, walking the impacts up the slope as the enemy drew closer. When Japanese troops reached the grenade range, every Marine who had grenades threw them. The explosions created a temporary barrier of smoke and shrapnel that slowed but didn't stop the assault. Company B of the raiders, positioned on the western slope of Hill 123, found itself in the worst position. Japanese troops had infiltrated through gaps in the Marine lines during the earlier fighting, and now they were attacking from 3 directions, simultaneously from the south, from the west, and from positions they'd occupied during the previous withdrawal. Captain Sperling, commanding Company B, realized his unit was about to be cut off and destroyed. He ordered a fighting withdrawal to a secondary position 50 yards closer to the ridge crest. The movement had to be executed under fire, at night, with wounded men who couldn't move quickly. It was the kind of tactical maneuver that training manuals said was nearly impossible to accomplish successfully under combat conditions. What made it possible was discipline born from months of training that had pushed men past what they thought they could endure. Each squad covered the withdrawal of the squad beside it. Wounded Marines were dragged or carried back by corpsmen and by fellow riflemen who exposed themselves to enemy fire to reach injured men. Machine gun crews maintained suppressing fire until the last possible moment, then disassembled their weapons and retreated with the guns and remaining ammunition. The withdrawal cost Company B 17 men killed or too badly wounded to move, but it prevented the complete collapse of the western flank and kept the defensive line intact. On the eastern slope, Company C was having better luck, though luck is a relative term when Japanese soldiers are charging your position in darkness. The company's defensive position offered better fields of fire. The slope was less heavily vegetated, and Marine riflemen could see approaching attackers earlier than their counterparts on the more densely jungled western slope. The company commander, Captain Lewis Walt, had positioned his machine guns in mutually supporting positions that created overlapping kill zones across every approach route. When Japanese troops tried to assault up the eastern slope, they ran into concentrated fire that literally mowed down entire ranks. Bodies piled up in front of Marine positions, creating obstacles that later waves had to climb over to continue the attack. The horror of it was absolute, but it was also effective. The eastern slope held. The most desperate fighting occurred on the southern face of Hill 123, where the ridge's crest was closest to Japanese positions and where attackers had the shortest distance to cover before reaching Marine lines. Here, Japanese troops actually reached and temporarily overran several Marine foxholes. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in darkness so complete that Marines couldn't always tell friend from enemy. Men fought with bayonets, rifle butts, trench knives, and bare hands. The noise was indescribable, screaming, cursing, the wet sounds of edged weapons striking flesh, the crack of rifles fired at point-blank range, the explosive thump of grenades detonated in confined spaces. Individual combats were resolved in seconds, with one man dead and the other already turning to face the next threat. Corporal Walter Burak, a machine gunner from Company C, became separated from his gun crew during the close-quarters fighting. He'd been firing his Browning M1917 at approaching Japanese troops when a grenade landed in his position. He threw it back, but the explosion when it detonated in mid-air temporarily blinded him and killed his assistant gunner. When his vision cleared enough to fight, Burak found himself alone with his machine gun, no ammunition except the partial belt remaining in the weapon, and Japanese soldiers literally 10 feet away preparing to charge his position. What Burak did next would earn him the Medal of Honor, though he wouldn't survive the night to receive it. He grabbed his machine gun, all 41 pounds of it, cradled it in his arms like a rifle, and charged directly at the Japanese troops. He fired the weapon from the hip as he ran, cutting down attackers at ranges where he could see their faces. When his ammunition ran out, he swung the machine gun like a club until Japanese soldiers overwhelmed him through sheer numbers. The Marines who later retook that position found Burak's body surrounded by 12 dead Japanese soldiers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fighting on September 13th continued through the night with a savage intensity that left both sides exhausted and bleeding. By 3 a.m., the Japanese attacks had finally begun to lose momentum. Kawaguchi's troops had been fighting continuously for 6 hours, attacking repeatedly up a slope that was costing them dozens of men with each assault. Casualties were mounting to unsustainable levels. Units that had begun the night with 100 men were down to 50 or fewer. Company-level organization was breaking down as officers and NCOs were killed faster than they could be replaced. Ammunition was running low. Japanese supply lines through the jungle were tenuous at best, and resupply during a night attack was nearly impossible. The Marines weren't much better off. Ammunition was critically low across the entire defensive line. Some rifle companies were down to 10 rounds per man. Machine gun crews had exhausted their ammunition and were reduced to using their weapons as clubs or firing captured Japanese rifles. Casualties had been horrific, approximately 40 Marines killed, more than 100 wounded seriously, enough to require evacuation. The battalion aid stations were overwhelmed, with corpsmen working by flashlight to stop bleeding, stabilize fractures, and keep critically wounded men alive until they could be evacuated to the division hospital near Henderson Field. Water was running low. Food was non-existent. Nobody had eaten since before the battle began. Exhaustion was so complete that Marines were falling asleep in their foxholes between Japanese assaults. But they were still holding. Dawn came slowly on September 13th, grey light filtering through the jungle canopy to reveal a battlefield that looked like something from World War I. The slopes of the ridge were carpeted with bodies, most Japanese, some Marine. Blood-soaked earth mixed with spent shell casings created a mud that stuck to everything. Smoke from fires started by artillery shells and grenades hung in the air, mixing with morning mist to create a fog that limited visibility to less than 50 yards. The smell was already becoming unbearable. Blood, cordite, burning vegetation, and the early stages of decomposition in tropical heat. Edson walked the lines as soon as there was enough light to see. He needed to assess his unit's condition and determine whether they could hold if the Japanese attacked again. What he found was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. His Marines had held, but they were at the absolute limit of human endurance. Many men were so exhausted they could barely stand. Wounded Marines who should have been evacuated were still in fighting positions because there weren't enough stretcher bearers to carry them out. Ammunition was so low that continued defense would require either immediate resupply or abandonment of the position. Edson sent runners to division headquarters requesting reinforcement, resupply, and artillery support for the coming night. He had no doubt the Japanese would attack again. The day of September 13th was spent preparing for that inevitable attack. Marines deepened foxholes, repositioned machine guns to cover approaches where Japanese attacks had been most successful the previous night, and redistributed what little ammunition remained to ensure every position had at least some. Corpsmen worked frantically to evacuate wounded men to the rear, a process complicated by the fact that the ridge had no road access and every casualty had to be carried by hand through nearly a mile of jungle terrain. Food and water arrived by mid-afternoon, carried forward by supply parties who'd spent the morning loading ammunition boxes and water cans onto their backs and humping them up the ridge. The supplies weren't nearly enough, but they were better than nothing. Artillery observers from the 11th Marines spent the day registering their weapons on likely Japanese assembly areas and approach routes. The gunners had learned during the previous night's fighting exactly where the Japanese were coming from, and they'd calculated firing solutions that would allow them to deliver devastating fire on those areas after dark. The artillery would be critical during the coming night's defense. Marine infantry couldn't hold indefinitely against superior numbers without fire support that could break up Japanese attacks before they reached the ridge. The Japanese were also preparing, though their preparations were hampered by losses that had decimated Kawaguchi's command structure. Senior officers were dead or wounded. Communication between units had broken down. Resupply through the jungle was moving slower than planned. The troops who'd fought all night were exhausted, and the reserves Kawaguchi had counted on had gotten lost in the jungle and wouldn't arrive in time for the evening attack. Despite these problems, Kawaguchi remained committed to his mission. He would attack again on the night of September 13th through 14th, and this time he would break through the Marine lines and recapture Henderson Field. The alternative, admitting failure and retreating, was unthinkable. Japanese military culture didn't permit commanders to fail and survive. As darkness fell on September 13th, both sides prepared for the battle's climax. The Marines knew they were facing a desperate enemy who would throw everything remaining at their position. The Japanese knew they were facing Marines who'd already demonstrated they wouldn't break easily. What neither side fully understood yet was just how costly the coming night would be. The second night's fighting began earlier than the first, with Japanese artillery opening fire at approximately 8 p.m. The bombardment was shorter but more accurate than the previous night's fire, indicating that Japanese forward observers had finally gotten good targeting data. Shells fell directly on Marine positions, collapsing foxholes and killing or wounding Marines who'd survived the previous night's fighting. The psychological effect was worse than the Kroster, physical damage. Marines who'd endured one night of hell now faced the prospect of another, and morale was beginning to crack. The infantry assault followed immediately after the artillery stopped. Japanese troops emerged from the jungle in waves that seemed endless. Kawaguchi had committed every available man to this attack, including his headquarters personnel, engineers, and support troops. This was an all-or-nothing gamble: either break through the Marine lines tonight, or accept that the campaign for Guadalcanal was lost. The attackers came screaming battle cries designed to terrorize defenders, waving flags and swords, firing rifles and throwing grenades as they charged up the slope. The Marines met them with fire that was initially devastating but rapidly declining as ammunition ran out. Riflemen fired carefully aimed shots, making every round count, knowing there were no more bullets coming if they emptied their magazines. Machine gunners fired in short bursts, conserving ammunition, while still maintaining enough volume of fire to stop Japanese assaults. Mortar teams calculated precisely where to drop their remaining rounds to achieve maximum effect. Every Marine on that ridge understood that ammunition conservation wasn't just good tactics, it was survival. The Japanese broke through the Marine lines in 3 places during the early hours of September 14th. These weren't tactical penetrations that could be immediately sealed by counterattack. They were actual breaches, where Japanese troops pushed through foxhole positions and began moving toward the ridge crest. If they reached the crest and moved down the northern slope, they would be behind the main Marine defensive line, and the battle would be effectively over. Edson recognized the crisis immediately and responded with the only reserves he had himself and his command post personnel. He grabbed his rifle, assembled every Marine within shouting distance who wasn't already in a fighting position, and personally led a counterattack to seal the breaches. The counterattack was everything military historians say shouldn't work: hastily organized, poorly coordinated, conducted by headquarters personnel who hadn't trained together, launched directly into the teeth of enemy forces that outnumbered the attackers. It worked anyway because the Marines were absolutely desperate, and because Edson led from the front, rifle in hand, shooting Japanese soldiers at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. The improvised counterattack force hit the Japanese penetrations from the flank, catching attackers who'd been focused on moving forward rather than defending their gains. Close quarters fighting erupted again: bayonets, rifle butts, grenades thrown at point-blank range. The battle resolved itself not through tactics or firepower but through sheer brutal violence, with one side or the other being killed or driven back from each contested position. 2 of the 3 breaches were sealed within an hour. The third, on the western slope where Company B had been forced to withdraw the previous night, proved more difficult. Japanese troops had established a foothold that included a machine gun position covering the approach routes Marine counterattackers would have to use. Direct assault was suicidal Marines, who tried were cut down before they got close. Edson needed artillery support to suppress that machine gun position, but calling artillery fire on a location that close to friendly troops was extremely dangerous. The margin for error was measured in yards, and a short round would kill Marines as effectively as it would kill Japanese soldiers. Captain Harry Torgerson, the artillery forward observer attached to the raiders, made the call to bring artillery fire in close. He adjusted rounds onto the Japanese position using corrections measured in 50-yard increments: drop 50, right 50, fire for effect. The process was agonizingly slow, with each adjustment requiring time to observe, calculate, and relay to the gun battery. Marines in nearby positions could hear the incoming shells, could feel the concussion from impacts that were walking progressively closer to both Japanese and American positions. One round fell short, landing among Marine foxholes and killing 3 men. Torgerson adjusted again, add 50, and the next salvo landed directly on the Japanese machine gun position, destroying the weapon and killing its crew. Marine infantry immediately assaulted through the shattered position and closed the breach. By 4 a.m. on September 14th, the Japanese attacks were finally breaking down completely. Kawaguchi's troops had suffered catastrophic casualties. Estimates would later suggest more than 800 dead and several hundred more wounded, too severely to continue fighting. Unit cohesion had disintegrated. Companies that had begun the offensive with 150 men were down to 20 or 30 effective soldiers. Officers were dead. NCOs were dead. Nobody knew where adjacent units were or what the overall tactical situation looked like. The survivors began withdrawing into the jungle without orders, driven by exhaustion, depleted ammunition, and the dawning realization that they'd failed to break the Marine defense despite 2 nights of maximum effort. The Marines didn't pursue immediately because they were in no condition to pursue anyone. Dawn on September 14th revealed a battalion that had been pushed to the absolute edge of destruction and somehow survived. Casualties among the raiders and the parachute battalion totaled approximately 60 killed and over 200 wounded, representing nearly 1/3 of the force that had begun the battle. Ammunition was exhausted. Many Marines had 0 rounds remaining. Water and food were gone. Medical supplies were depleted. The only reason the position hadn't fallen was that the Japanese offensive had collapsed first. Reinforcements arrived throughout the morning of September 14th. Fresh Marine battalions moved up to the ridge, bringing ammunition, water, food, and most importantly, rested troops who could hold the position if the Japanese attacked again. Edson's raiders and the parachute battalion were pulled back to rest areas near Henderson Field, where they would spend the next several days recovering, being resupplied, and trying to process what they'd just survived. The ridge they'd defended so desperately would officially be designated Edson's Ridge in recognition of the colonel's leadership during the battle, though the Marines who'd fought there would always call it simply the Ridge, as if no other geographic feature in the world mattered. The battlefield cleanup took days. Marine burial details counted Japanese bodies on the slopes of the ridge, and in the jungle approaches final tallies ranged from 600 to over 1,000 dead, depending on which reports you believed. The actual number probably fell somewhere in that range, representing one of the most lopsided kill ratios in modern military history. American dead totaled approximately 60, with another 200 to 300 wounded. The mathematics were stark. The Marines had inflicted roughly 10 to 15 casualties for every casualty they'd taken. That ratio reflected superior defensive positions, better training, devastating artillery support, and a level of individual combat effectiveness that Japanese planners hadn't anticipated. But the numbers, as stark as they were, didn't capture what the battle had meant. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The Japanese offensive to retake Guadalcanal had been broken. Kawaguchi's brigade had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force, with survivors scattered through the jungle, many without weapons, all without organization. The strategic implications were enormous. Japan had committed significant resources to recapturing Guadalcanal, and those resources had been wasted in a series of attacks that had accomplished nothing except killing Japanese soldiers. The pattern would repeat throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, Japanese attacks breaking against Marine defenses, Japanese casualties mounting to unsustainable levels, Japanese strategic position deteriorating despite local tactical successes. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, visited Edson's position on the afternoon of September 14th. He walked the battlefield, examined the defensive positions, talked to surviving Marines, and assessed what had happened. His report to Admiral Robert Gormley, commanding South Pacific Forces, was characteristically understated. The Raiders and Parachute Battalion have performed magnificently under the most difficult conditions. The position was held. That was it. No flowery language, no dramatic descriptions, just a simple statement of fact. The position was held. Vandergrift recommended Edson for the Medal of Honor, which he would receive in early 1943. Multiple other Marines from the battle also received medals, Navy Crosses, Silver Stars, Bronze Stars. Corporal Burak's Medal of Honor was presented posthumously to his family. The official citations for these medals used the formal language of military awards, but they couldn't quite capture what those Marines had actually experienced during 2 nights of fighting that had pushed them past every limit they thought existed. The Japanese response to the failure at Edson's Ridge was to plan another attack. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo couldn't accept that Guadalcanal might be lost, that American forces might successfully hold an offensive position in territory Japan considered part of its defensive perimeter. More troops would be sent, more attacks would be launched. The pattern would continue until February 1943, when the last Japanese forces finally evacuated the island after 6 months of continuous fighting that had cost Japan approximately 25,000 dead. But all of that was still in the future. On September 14, 1942, the immediate crisis was over. Henderson Field was secure, the Marines had held, and Merritt Edson's 840 men had proven that well-trained infantry in prepared positions could defeat numerically superior forces through discipline, firepower, and an absolute refusal to break even when breaking seemed like the only rational choice. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.